of the handling of the economy in the past 4 years. But specifically, before we get into the areas of challenges, some persons will raise questions as to the individual pocket feel of the policies, programs, and measures that you have articulated. So, again, what is your assessment of that? I'm referring now to the individual pocket feel. I'm sure you have a pocket there, so how much of it do you feel in your pocket?
Well, you know, there is always an element of contradiction when we economists we are analyzing the performance of the economy. It is good if there is an accretion in the foreign reserve, which gives some stability to our exchange rate and which also give confidence to investors. It is logical if the Naira exchange rate is stable. It is logical if there is some element of stability in inflation or it is coming down. But the reality is, how much has every level of governmental expenditure and spending at federal and state level decisively impact on our unacceptable level of poverty and impoverishment? How much has an ordinary Nigerian on the street feel the impact of the economic development and growth that we are talking about? In what way are we able to move people out of poverty arising from our governmental policies and programs? In as much as we are spending trillions and trillions, but we are not able to make a significant dent on unemployment, our economic policies have not achieved what they are supposed to achieve. In as much as the number of millions of ordinary Nigerians that cannot afford 3 square meals per day have not been reduced significantly, our economic policies have not yet been able to achieve their objective. In as much as we have over 11 million out of school children, despite massive investment by UBEC and others, and we are not able to reduce that number, we cannot be able to say that we have achieved so much. In as much as significant number of Nigerians cannot get quality medical care, despite massive investment in healthcare, then we have a lot of questions to raise. So fundamentally, the question, or the most important thing that we as intellectuals and policymakers need to sit down and talk is, in what way can we be able to think out of the box, put up economic policies that actually decimate absolute poverty and reduce impoverishment so that ordinary Nigerians can really feel the impact of billions or trillions and trillions of naira being spent. Until we are able to achieve that, I think our achievement as a country is really questionable.
Yes, sir. I think Ali, you have to come in here. It's in the same matter of pocket pocket matter that Christy raised. It's very important. And this government, we know, of course, embarked on social investment programs, meant to touch the lives of the ordinary Nigerians. And we also know that about 13 million people have been said to be touched by this. The trader money and the likes, of course, along the radar of what the government has put in place for this important policy of government. And along the line of the same question that Kingsley raised, are Nigerians really feeling the impact of the enormous budgeting and allocations given to different strata of economic life? Of course, we know that government has also been on capital projects in this country. Constructions are going on, the rules, ways, and what have you. How are all these impacting on our people in terms of what you take home?
All right. Thank you, Kiram. You see, let me start by this. So you remember earlier I said one good thing about the Buhari's economy, is there is something for everybody, for the top, for the middle, for the lower. The lower is what he started with. That's the social investment program that this government has actually churned out. It's the biggest, in the African continent, actually, and it's the most comprehensive, at least in Nigeria. And what does it do? It actually touches the life of the most vulnerable Nigerians, the poorest of the poor, through, are you talking about the Empower, which targets the graduates, unemployed graduates? It reduced about 500 100,000 people from the streets that could have otherwise have been unemployed. We are talking about homegrown school feeding program, which has the value chain is significant. You are talking about the women, the farmers, how many eggs in a day that these schools actually cater for the school pupils from primary 1 to primary 3. You know, the value chain is astronomical. Then we're talking about other incentives like the trader money, farmer money, loans, soft loans. You don't need collateral. All you need is a revolving loan. You take, you repay back, and you get a double of what you were actually given earlier. All this, very good. But yes, we are many. We are more than that in this country, a country of about 200 million. So how much more can that do? But at least baby steps, right? Then you talk about the issue of construction and how can that really affect Nigerians. And that is where I want to really say something. You see, there are two categories of Nigerians. There are a Nigerian, that is a Nigerian. We talk about unemployment. Yes, you go to the NBA statistics, you see the figure, maybe a projection even to rise about 32% or so unemployment rate. But have they captured also the informal sector? I don't think so. The diversification policy of this administration, if you are to aggregate or account for the number of farmers that have come on board through the Rice and Crop Funds and other schemes that are coming from Bank of Industry, CBN, and other development banks, you will see that millions of jobs have been created. That statistics are normally not captured by economists and by MBS. Now, also you have to understand, there is someone who would go and look for the little thing to do, and someone will stay at home, waiting for a white collar or is it blue collar job at home. But for someone that will go, you know, to a construction site and work, look at every state, there is a construction going on, either road or even rail. If you are working in the construction site, you are paid either daily or on weekly basis. And by the time you get paid, you will take that money, you will buy bread. The bread owner will buy flour. The flour will buy okrika. And that's how you actually support the growth, you stimulate the economy. So if you look at this, I will say, you know, those category of Nigerians that fall within all these brackets I mentioned, they are at least, you know, they are seeing something from these initiatives of government. Of course, you cannot cover everybody. Now also, we have to also talk about something. The anti-corruption policy of this administration, although it's a different something, but it is closely related to also the economic drive that we're talking about. Because when this government fights corruption, it also frees the money in the economy so that it can be used on also some of these schemes and policies so that what you are talking, our individual people will feel the difference. And I'll tell you, I have testimony, I have seen it, you know, from a lot of Nigerians, poorest Nigerians that could have ordered, that they don't have, like Professor said, the means of eating, even some of them, even once in a day, from states in Kogi, from Southwest, from the Northeast, from the Northwest, through the social investment programs. This conditional 5,000 cash transfer that they are giving to widows, the poorest of the poor, the most vulnerable, I've seen women use it to actually turn it to a business, grinding machine business, other forms of this, even poultry farming, from 5,000 that you aggregate, you are giving in 2 months 10,000. So government is doing something, but we cannot cover everybody. Right. The government cannot cover everybody.
Ali Abdullahi, thank you very much for your comments. Let's return to Muda Yusuf in Lagos. Still on the impact of policies, programs, and measures on the individual pocket field. Now, if you listen carefully to Ali Abdullahi, it seems to be saying that the individual pocket field is there amongst the poorest of the poor. So could the absence of sufficient feel of the impact be a middle-class complaint?
Yes, I don't quite agree with the last speaker, because when we talk about the impact of government or the impact of policies on the ordinary Nigerians, we should be talking from a systemic point of view. What the government has done in terms of trader money and some of these social investment programs are good. But to a large extent, they are also more of symbolic things. In terms of the real impact of government policies and actions on Nigerians, I think not much can come directly from government itself. A lot will have to come from the private sector. Because we are dealing with a population estimated currently at about 200 million. How much can the government directly do to impact on people? Because the welfare of the people is related to a large extent on the level of employment or unemployment. And there's a limit to which the government can do in this space. I mean, the totality of the federal government budget is less than 10% of our GDP. That's a measure, a reflection of the impact of even the government finances on government. And we just said that about 70% of that is actually going to recurrent. So in terms of direct impact, you are talking of a very, very insignificant proportion of government revenue impacting the economy. This economy is about 130 trillion. We are talking of a budget of about 9 trillion. So we need to look beyond the issue of government. Government spending is important, but government policies that will trigger and stimulate investment at all levels of investment, either at the micro level, at the SME level, at the medium enterprise level, at the foreign direct investment level, at the domestic investment level, these things are much more important. Because it is through these platforms that you can easily touch a lot more people in terms of employment. Because the welfare of the people starts essentially from the amount of jobs you're able to create. Look at the job numbers. The job numbers have been increasing, and it's becoming increasingly very disturbing. So we need to deal with critical issues of productivity in this economy. This economy is still largely dependent on the oil sector. That is a major, major concern for everybody. If anything happens today, there's a major drop in oil price or in oil outputs, all this stability that we celebrate, everything will come to naught. The whole thing will come crumbling. So we have to deal a lot more with the issues of diversifying this economy. This economy is still very fragile. We have recorded some growth, no doubt. But most of this growth are also driven by external factors, which we don't have much control over. So we should be looking at, the government has been doing well, but we need to look a lot more to see how we can bring in more private investments into this economy and into all sectors of the economy, whether it's in infrastructure, in manufacturing, in agriculture. We need to put all sorts of policies on the table. Our tax policy must support this process. Our trade policy must support this process. Our monetary policy, interest rate policy must support this process. Our foreign exchange policy must support this process. And our regulatory institutions should support this process. Because the greater emphasis should be on how we mobilize a lot more investment. What we are seeing in the last 1 or 2 years, a lot of our investment is going to treasury bills. It's going to federal government bonds. If you check the books of the banks, almost 70% of their investment is going into treasury bills and federal government bonds. How much impact will that have in terms of investments that will create jobs? So we should be dealing at much more, fundamental issues, because we can build a competitive economy, an economy that, can be self-sustaining, that can sustain itself outside of the oil sector.
Moda Yusuf, I would like to remain with you because I'd like you to clarify a number of issues. Aliu was speaking from the point of view of what government has been able to do, in the direction of ensuring that Nigerians have something in their pocket. And now you are disagreeing with that, and you brought in something very important here, and that's the issue of the private sector in the entire drive. You are the DG of Lagos Chamber of Commerce, and I want to ask you, how much of manufacturing are your members doing in this country? Are they just the importers? I ask this question because one analyst did say that Nigeria does not have any international product. Not issue of beverages or perishables and what have you, but international products like telephone sets and things like that. Now, what is the manufacturing, the Chamber of Commerce, your members doing to bring in that private sector initiative that you will mention now, because government has made it clear that there's now the ease of doing business in Nigeria, is very healthy.
See, the reality is that an economy gets the kind of investment that it deserves. The private sector entrepreneurs or investors will put their capital where you can get returns. I just alluded to the situation where almost 70% of the financial resources in this country is going into investment in treasury bills and federal government bonds. That's a major distortion as far as investment is concerned. And it is the incentive. I mean, if you invest in treasury bills, you get returns of about 14%, 15%. The risk is free because it's sovereign debt. There is no tax on it. Can you compare that to going into manufacturing where you have to import machineries, where you have to be grappling with the customs and their proper gridlock, where you have to sometimes pay interest of about 25% on the facilities that you get? So it is the environment that will determine the kind of investment. As we speak, manufacturing is contributing less than 10% of our GDP. And manufacturing products are not competitive. Earlier, there were some discussions about smuggling and all of this. These are symptoms of an environment that is not competitive. When you are producing and your cost of production is so high, look at the cost of diesel. I acknowledge that some efforts have been made in terms of power, but in terms of the output and outcomes in the power situation, the situation is still very bad. A lot of manufacturers are still depending on either gas or depending on diesel. Diesel is about 240 naira per liter. By the time you produce with diesel and by the time you move your products across the country, the cost of transportation is still high. So there's still a whole lot of work that we need to do to scale up productivity, because if you don't have an economy that is productive and it's competitive, especially from the private sector point of view, it will be difficult to be competitive internationally, even domestically. And it will be very difficult to create an economy that is inclusive, because it is through these jobs, through the connectivity between the different regions, that is how you can build an economy that is inclusive. Imagine you have rice in Kebbi. At what cost are you going to transport it to Lagos or to Ibadan or to the east? The cost of transportation is still a big issue. So the point I'm making is that for us to have the kind of impact that we need to have, we need to create an environment that will bring down the cost of production and make production much more competitive than what it is now.
All right, Muda Yusuf, thank you very much. Let's return to Professor Mike Obadan in our Benin Network studios. Prof, I mean, if you wish to speak on the issue of the impact of policies and programs, fair enough. But since we're already dealing with what would appear to be gaps and challenges in the economy, and therefore the way forward, Muda Yusuf already touched on one of them. He says, look, we will need to mobilize more resources, this time from the private sector, for investment purposes. And in doing that, you must have the right mix of trade, monetary, tax, and regulatory policies in place, including interest rates, of course. What is your take on this?
Thank you very much, Kingsley. Let me say that in terms of impact, I endorse the position of the DG Lagos Chamber of Commerce to the effect that the private sector has the preponderant role in generating jobs, reducing poverty, and also making government policies to impact very positively on the majority of Nigerian people. But then we must see the social investment program as only being complementary to whatever, we expect, the private sector to do in terms of promoting growth in the country, generating employment, and reducing poverty. So it must not be misunderstood as if it's taking the place of the private sector. No, definitely not. I don't think the government envisaged it, to be so. What the government is doing through the social investment program at the moment is having significant impact, particularly in the spheres of empowerment of small and medium enterprises, trader money, government enterprise, program, and so on and so forth. The conditional transfers is also very desirable to the extent that it is focused on those families or households that do not have any source of support, either from their children or relatives, and they are just there, and they need to survive. But then I agree with the position that the growth, that we are pursuing at the moment is not yet inclusive, in the sense that it doesn't generate so much jobs. It doesn't reduce much poverty. And therefore, going forward, the policies must focus on how to empower small, micro, and medium enterprises to be able to step up their production activities, their business activities, expand, and then employ people. Where does government come in there? Government will come in by way of encouraging such enterprises with adequate infrastructure, particularly electricity supply. The state of electricity generation and distribution today is still, on the very low scale, low side. And many enterprises, both small, medium, and big enterprises, still rely heavily on generating sets, which then increases their cost of production, which Muda Yusuf rightly mentioned. So government must do something about that one. In the last 4 years, yes, efforts have been made, but such efforts have not yielded the desired results in terms of significant improvement in electricity. So government must bear that one in mind. Road infrastructure, rail infrastructure, that one will also have to be stepped up. What does that one imply? That public investment would have to be stepped up very, very significantly. In the area of policies, monetary, fiscal, trade policies, yes, such policies have performed fairly well in the past 4 years. I would expect that monetary policy will continue to support the objectives of growth and development in the country by way of facilitating, credit to private sector enterprises at, affordable interest rates. And I think all the central bank supported intervention programs are already doing this because they attract interest rates of less than 10%, 9%, or less. And importantly too, monetary policy must continue to support trade policy. The bank has done that one, through interventions, foreign exchange market interventions, by way of withholding access of certain enterprises from, for foreign exchange to import goods that can be produced in Nigeria.
All right, Prof, we'll just pause you there. We'll return to you, of course, if time can allow us to do that. Now, we are going to take a short break right away. When we return, we will take other perspectives of this conversation, because I had wanted Professor Dama to go into the cluster concept, which was introduced by the previous administration and sustained by this administration with respect to the issue of economic free zones, business parks, and what have you. So thank you for staying with us up to this moment on Good Morning Nigeria, your GMN. Let's take a short break now. When we come back, the program continues.
Can I see your particulars, sir?
Officer, my particulars no dey here.
In that case, you'll have to come with me to the police station.
Officer, which levels? Where I for find you something make you take arrange your weekend.
What? Offense number 1, driving without particulars. Offense number 2, trying to bribe an officer of the law.
I won't harass Nigerians or take bribe. Change begins with me.
This message is brought to you by the National Orientation Agency in conjunction with the Federal Ministry of Information and Culture.
All right, Professor Dama, before we went on break, I just highlighted a number of issues we could look at. And if you also would like to make reference to the comments of our guests in Benin and Lagos with respect to the impact of the present economic system.
Certainly. Before I answer your question, I would like to comment on an aspect raised by Muda Lawal.
Muda Yusuf.
Muda Yusuf, sorry.
Muda Lawal was a footballer. He was a great midfielder.
I know. Sorry for the slip of the tongue.
No, that's all right.
Now, the reality is that for a very long period of time, this country has given so much incentive to the private sector. But unfortunately, we don't have what is called reciprocity framework of actually what the private sector is doing as a way of reciprocating for the justice done to them by the government. If you realize, before the coming of this administration, there was a lot of tax waivers given to private sector enterprises, running into hundreds of billions, with the main aim of making their products cheaper and accessible. We have not seen that. You remember there was an issue relating to the export expansion grant and the abuses that were associated with it, and most of them are perpetuated by the so-called private sector individuals. You see, the reality is that when we introduced structural adjustment program in the year 1986, precisely on 26 September, mostly we didn't have the necessary regulatory framework to be able to control and guide and direct what the private sector will do and checkmating their excesses. And then we unleash private sector orientation and market economy without the corresponding expansion in the regulatory framework. An individual in the private sector, his major objective is to make as much money as possible, irrespective of what will happen. Exactly. And then the focus of government is to make sure that it protects the individuals and make sure that the individual does not exploit disproportionately. There is no single economy in the world that is fully market-oriented. When you go to the US, when you go to Europe, when you go to Japan, government intervene to make sure that things are right, because markets in themselves are left alone, have not, will not, and will never ensure optimality in resource allocation. And this is the reality. That is one.
Are you still on the same point?
Yes.
By Muda Yusuf?
Yes, on the same point. Right. Now, I have said it also times without number in our various programs. Now, if you look at the reality of our economy, there are certain fundamental things that we need to do, and we need to be honest to ourselves to be able to achieve that. The configuration of this country is made up of 3 types of government. It is only the federal government that is serious. What is happening at the state is beyond imagination, is below expectation, and the state and the local government significantly represent almost half of the national economy. So we need to have more collaboration at the federal level with the state governments and the local government. The usual monthly meeting of the National Economic Council that is discussing issues that are not really serious to the economy, I think we need to change that orientation. We need to have a realistic discussion as to what we need to do differently in order to move this economy forward. First, the costing of capital projects at the federal, state, and local government is extremely and disproportionately unacceptable and high relative to the realities of our domestic economy. We need to sit down and talk. Are we going to continue dissipating resources in the name of capital projects that could give us much more than what we are getting? Or are we going to have realistic costing of capital projects in line with international benchmark and standards, where, for example, Nigerian Institute of Quantity Surveyors are the ones that will actually cost capital projects? And I challenge anyone to contradict me. Pick any capital project at the federal and state government level, bring a quantity surveyor, let him cost it, you'll see a cost reduction. I challenge anyone to talk differently and to challenge me for a debate on this. That is one. Number two, Number three. Now, the way and manner we are going about with capital projects and using debt as a strategy to finance capital projects, let me say it with clear sense of national pride, is not sustainable. Other economies that have really peeled off their infrastructure gap, whether in Brazil, whether in India, whether in Malaysia, they usually do it through public-private partnership where sovereign wealth funds invest their resources into those projects, maybe on a build, operate, and transfer basis. And therefore, the inbuilt profitability is derived from the implementation of the project and its operationalization, and it leaves no debt on the economy. Our present debt profile and its insustainability, and the fact that the oil market is not sustainable, and the fact that the DMO, the Debt Management Office, have never said to people what is the total volume of contingent liability that is on this country. Because it's not just the debt of the federal government and the state government. There are debts even guaranteed for the private sector and state government by the federal government. And if they crystallize arising from economic recession, the burden is on the federal government, and nobody is talking about that. And where we are taking relatively 68 cents of every dollar we earn in order to service debt, people will just be telling you that the debt to GDP ratio is sustainable. It's not sustainable. What is the sustainability framework is to compare our debt service payment and debt profile to our earnings and income. If you have a house that is not earning rent, and then you went and contract debt, how can you be able to pay the debt?
Well, Professor Nazir Vidama.
So there are fundamental issues that we need to discuss. And finally, the government need to work in such a way that it will stop listening to ministers and advisors only. The government, particularly at federal and state level, they need to have think tanks of individuals who don't hold appointment and can look at Mr. President and the governor and say, Mr. President, sir, what you are doing is wrong. We need to do something differently. Mr. Governor, what you are doing is not sustainable. We need to do something differently. Until we have that, their political appointees will continue to tell them what they want to hear. Yeah, and that is not the reality. All right.
Professor Nazir Vidama, thank you very much. You raised 4 points, but the fifth one, which you will have the opportunity of coming back to, you will be to answer the question posed by Kirian on the economic clusters, that's economic zones. We'll come to that. But why the subject is still hot, one of the questions, Kirian, one of the issues pertaining to the sustainability of using debt to finance infrastructure, we would like Professor Michael Badan to respond to that from Benin. But immediately, Mr. Muda Yusuf, I would like you to respond to at least 2 of the issues that Professor Dama raised. One is the unrequited performance, as it were, of the private sector, despite a slew of incentives by the federal government, on the basis of what you have also said, that the private sector ordinarily is a generator of jobs and economic prosperity, and yet we have a number of incentives coming to the private sector, and what we keep hearing will be the same old story.
No power.
What's your reaction?
Yes, I think the prof has not been fair to the private sector. Because just imagine where this economy will be today without the private sector. Look at practically all sectors of this economy. Look at what the likes of Dangote has done in cement and some other private enterprises. Look at what Dangote is doing in terms of the refineries. Look at what the situation is with our oil and gas sector today. Today, we are importing petroleum products to the tune of not less than $8 billion annually. And that's in addition to the challenges of subsidy, of smuggling, and all of that. These are consequences of having a public sector dominance in an economy. Part of the biggest problems we have in this economy today is the pressure on our foreign reserves, pressure on our foreign exchange market arising from importation of petroleum products. Why is it that up till today, we have 4 refineries, and yet we cannot refine petroleum products? These are consequences of when you put very strategic institutions in the public sector space. The public sector is not cut out to be running enterprises of that nature. The public sector is cut out to focus on social sector issues, education, health, environment, and things like that. Even in the social sector, where will this economy be today without private investment in education? Look at private schools, private primary schools, private secondary schools, private universities, and polytechnics. Look at what is the private sector doing in financial services, in aviation. Where will the country be without a private sector in aviation? Even in broadcasting, electronic media. You see, there's a whole lot that the private sector is doing, and we need to appreciate that. I agree with you, there will be some, bad eggs in any system. And some of these things happen because there is collusion with some unscrupulous private sector people and those in government. It's an institutional issue. If you have weak institutions, bad people will take advantage of such weak institutions. So we should be focusing more on dealing and ensuring that you have the right kind of institutions to ensure that policies achieve the right kind of outcomes. If institutions are failing, you don't put the blame on the private sector. I don't agree with that. So my feeling is that if there are people who have committed infractions, we should have the institutional framework to ensure that there are consequences. Part of the problems we have in this country is that there are no consequences, either in the private sector or in the public sector. That is why the standard of governance, the standard of a lot of things have degenerated. If you have a system that ensures that there is prompt consequences for action, we will not have the kind of problems we are having today. So that is my take. There's a whole lot that the private sector is doing. If there are infractions, let there be consequences. Nobody will be here to protect anybody that is doing anything that is untoward. But it is important that when you throw incentives at the system, we should look at the context in which the business is functioning. Look at how much incentive we are given to textile industries. For over 2 decades, we have banned importation of textiles. We are giving them 100 billion naira intervention funds. We have done all sorts of things, yet the textile industries are still comatose. Why? It's because of the totality of the environment. So when we look at issues, we should look at it within the context in which those businesses are operating.
All right, we appreciate your comment, protecting your constituency. But we also know that when it comes to education, you mentioned education started from with a private establishment. I mean, they were owned then by missionaries and so on. And on the issue of oil, you mentioned, recall that under the Abuja administration, 7 licenses were issued to the private sector persons to establish refineries, but they never did, right? And now Dangote is on it. You mentioned Dangote about three good times on what he is doing nationally and internationally. Well, it can't just be him. Other people also enjoyed certain incentives that were never, gone far, the way he did. Because as the people put their money, where are going to get the benefits almost immediately. Nobody wants to venture into manufacturing, which has a lot of processes, that are required before you begin to make your gains. So that's part of the problem, the process from what we have appreciated, in a couple of decades now in this country. Now, let our man, Michael Baden, Professor Baden, please briefly too, on the issue of debt of financing projects in Nigeria. You can speak to that.
Thank you very much, Kirian. Let me say that, in principle, there is no problem in using loans or debt to finance infrastructure. I think the problem in the past had been that monies borrowed and allegedly meant to finance infrastructure or other projects, had been mismanaged or diverted, or spent on consumption. And if we have to borrow to finance projects, then we must comply with certain cardinal principles of debt management. For example, we will need to deploy such borrowed funds to projects that can aid the productivity of the economy or the other sectors. Productivity increases, they're able to earn more money, revenue, and then the loan can be repaid through increased taxes. Or the projects themselves can generate funds which can be used in repaying the principal and then interest payments. But more often than not, this is not done. And in the case of external borrowing, we also expect a situation whereby the borrowed funds from abroad that will need to be repaid in foreign currency, not naira, must be deployed to projects that can increase export of goods and services and export earnings, or reduce the importation, of goods and services. Once this is the case, we can easily borrow either within the country or outside the country to finance, various projects. But let me also add that one thing that we must, look forward to doing, in the future is that once we borrow money, either within the country or outside, we should deploy them to targeted projects that can generate revenue. For example, road network. Deploy them to certain highways on which tolls can be imposed. So the tolls...
All right, Professor Obadan, sorry we're having to jump in there. We're getting now really pressed for time. Let's bring in very quickly Aliu Abdullahi again. There are a number of matters on the table, but very succinctly. Professor Dama also referenced it, and indeed the other speakers, to some extent. How can we, as a people, as a nation, ensure that we also bring in the subnational entities into the economic growth prospects that we are yearning for? A number of state governments, are pulling their weight, but if we were to take the average, they would appear to be more who are just said, oh, we are a civil service state. You come to Abuja, get your allocation, you go back, you pay salaries, and then everybody is, the governor has done very well, is an emperor, local government chairman is an emperor in his own small right. And at the end of the day, the jobless numbers that we are talking about, out of school children, they come from the local governments, they come from the states. So how do we, as citizens of the nation, get the subnational entities to be more active in terms of formulating policies, taking directives, taking direction, as it were, from what is happening at the national level?
Well, though you say succinctly, you see, it has to start from actually the election cycle. Unfortunately, that's where you have to either get it right or wrong. You have to actually get the right leaders who have focused vision, who can actually think how to, because each state is an economy in itself. You have to look at what is their own competitive and comparative advantage, as a state. What will work, for example, for a Lagos state will not work for a Kano state or a Zamfara state. And what will work for Kaduna or Niger cannot work for Lagos. Lagos has no lands, so they can't actually concentrate on agri. But what do they have? They have water, so they have limited space, but they improve and they increase their tax base and collection and all these policies towards that. But when you come, for example, to far north, what do we have in far north? We have the land and we have the population. So what did I tell you? In factors, in basic economic factors of production, it means you can actually do get your policies, economic policies toward farming and things like that. And almost all the states have natural resources, in them, which we don't actually explore the right way. We don't have the policies or the regulations to do that. But by and large, the things that you need really to do, the leaders have to know what to do. Tap in your competitive and comparative advantage as a state.
Ali, we have to really stop you here. Gentlemen, it's been a very, very interesting conversation this morning. We have a large population and fast-growing middle class and what have you. And it was said that about 65 million Nigerians are economically active, but perhaps we have some spatial fragmentation because of lack of cohesiveness in doing all of that, which of course Professor Ndema actually said earlier. Now let's go to the tweets now. Some persons have been making contributions to the conversation. Law Alpha C. The recurrent expenditure of all levels of government is on the high side. The federal government should exercise the political will to drastically reduce the cost of governance, particularly at the National Assembly.
Now, Benjamin Unze tweets, the soul of sustaining economic development of Nigeria is the provision of jobs. That will increase also productivity, lower cost of living, increased standard of living, and all of which, of course, will lead to savings and investment and reduction in crimes.
Ibatibi Zekeri, power sector is very key to the nation's development. The next level agenda should be focused on fixing the power as it helps to create jobs.
Now, Moses Akigbe tweets, economic growth is usually via SMEs. Now, how have the SMEs fared in recent years? Economic growth in Edo State is an example the federal should emulate from a solely civil service state to an emerging economic hub.
Francis, more private sector or private investment and ease of doing business should be encouraged. Private sectors, they are one of the major economic drivers and the large employers of labor.
Now, Akeju Olagbaju tweets, now to a large extent, Buharinomics has worked with inflation low and exchange rate is stable. Yes, the impact may not have permeated, but the states also need to align their economic development policies to complement the federal so as to increase growth.
Jermaine Martins, anytime I analyze the economic policies of this administration, my hope as a Nigerian is restored. Villagers now have something handy to say Nigeria is moving forward. I'm an unemployed graduate, but my confidence has no limit that I shall fit in before this administration elapses.
Shakiru tweets, it's good that everybody is commending the government for the improvement in the economy, but where are the experts for security in the country that will save the economy for a much longer time?
Zekeri once more said the guest is talking about what are the plan for them, the beneficiaries. We all know the program is on 2 years basis. Will there be laid off to go back to the street again?
All right, Kirian, I think those are the tweets that we can take. We'd like to thank all those, who sent in their tweets. And just, another polite reminder, a tweet, make it short, not more than 2 short sentences. And we have the opportunity of reading those tweets. One of those last tweets was talking just now about security. And we see what is happening in the Northwest and the response of the security agencies, what impact that might have on economic growth later on in the year. Of course, we'll begin to see the numbers. Yes, on that note, we'd like to thank all our 4 guests who've been with us. It's been a very interesting conversation. From our Lagos Network Studios, Muda Yusuf, Director General of Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, always a delight having you on Good Morning Nigeria. Thank you for being with us. Professor Michael Badan, Professor of Economics and member of the Central Bank Monetary Policy Committee. Pleasure having you once again. You joined us from our Benin Network studios. Thanks a lot for being around. And here in the Abuja studios, Aliyu Abdullahi, lawyer and economic policy analyst. Thanks a lot for being around with us.
Thank you, Philip.
And last but not least, Professor Nazif Dama, Professor of Economics, University of Abuja. Delight having you on Good Morning Nigeria. Unfortunately, the fifth item responding to the cluster issue, we're unable to take it, but that's a matter with KIV.
And we need to host him and Yusuf.
Yusuf, that's right.
On the private
that's
sector.
Right. So, gentlemen, we'd like to thank you for being with us. Of course, we have sports, we have entertainment, we have those on other programs. Today is another big action day in European Champions League. Liverpool, they have a mountain to climb. It's on that note, we'd like to thank you for tuning in to Good Morning Nigeria today. We're back tomorrow, same time, 7 o'clock in the morning. My name is Kingsley Osadolo.
And I am Kieran Umar. It's been a pleasure having you this morning. Well, we'll see you again tomorrow.